I'm good.
You did say to start, correct?
Yep. Well, I think we can start, and I want to, welcome all of you folks to our presentation tonight, which is a really special one. And because it's so special, we're going to have a special person introduce Josh, and I will take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Pam. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Josh Smith, who is a professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York. Josh is surely well known to many in the audience based on his many publications about the cross-border Passamaquoddy region, as well as his very active role as a host for many Border Historical Society's Zoom events. Josh has many ties to Maine and the Down East region, including degrees from Maine Maritime Academy and a 2003 PhD in history from the University of Maine, which is where I had the good fortune to encounter Josh. I am pretty sure in what was my very first graduate seminar that I taught at UMaine in the late 1990s. So what a pleasure for me to be here so many years later and have the chance to introduce him. At UMaine, Josh did a dissertation which had the terrific title, The Rogues of Quoddy, Smuggling in the Maine-New Brunswick Borderlands. And that was the basis for his book, Borderland Smuggling, Patriots, Loyalists, and Illicit Trade in the Northeast, 1783 to 1820. That appeared in the Maritime History series of the University of Florida Press, and it won the John Lyman Award in American Maritime History in 2007. In addition to his wide-ranging work that he has done in support of public history in Eastport, Josh is also the director of the American Merchant Marine Museum in Kings Point, New York. Josh has been very active as a maritime historian generally, and with a more particular emphasis on the War of 1812. He pays probing attention to the US, Canadian, and British dimensions of the conflict, especially in the northeastern borderlands. This evening, he will share some insights from his most recent book entitled Making Maine, Statehood and the War of 1812, which the University of Massachusetts Press has just published this fall. I want to apologize before I end these remarks that my own public history commitments on the City of Bangor's Historic Preservation Commission that meets this evening means that I will duck out of this Zoom meeting just before 7 o'clock, probably just as we're getting into the Q&A session that will wrap things up. But please write down ideas and questions that you have for Josh and enjoy a lively discussion without me. I very much look forward to learning more from the talk this evening and from reading Josh's new book. Please join me in welcoming Joshua M. Smith.
Well, thank you. I'm really flattered that Professor Reardon, who I remember is, he showed up at Orono as a shiny new professor, and here he is with his own amazing career there in Orono. So thank you, Liam, and thank you, Pam Beveridge, for arranging this meeting, and thanks to the Border Historical Society, which did something really amazing for me. Not only have they said kind things to me over the years, which is really appreciated, but they actually sponsored, or in academic terms, provided a subvention for the publication of this book by University of Massachusetts Press. And I'm pretty good at beating the bushes for money, and I got turned down by lots of places with deep pockets, and who knew that the people of Eastport, Maine, would be so generous and supportive, and really very touching that they would do that. And I want to send a special thanks out to Ruth McInnes, who's Pam's mom, aka Pam's mom, who has provided me with supportive words for, oh boy, since Liam knew me as a graduate student at the University of Maine. We'll put it that way. And many of you have been very kind to me in the past. So, all right. So the book should be out any day now. I haven't gotten hands on a hard copy yet, but I think they're going out in the next week or so. The official release is November 25. I want you guys to know you're getting the first presentation about this book. The Maine Historical Society gets a presentation in November. So this is the very first one. And I would point out, if you go to the University of Massachusetts Press website, until October 31st, there is a, get this, 40% discount on the book. And I think the usual cost for the paperback is $35. You take 20% off that, and you're down to $20 and change, I think. A really good deal. So let me recommend that you do that. The Border Historical Society is a wonderful group, and I would encourage all of you to join for, as I always say, 10 Yankee dollars per year. It would be greatly appreciated. And as always in the Border Historical Society, we encourage you to use the chat function to write down questions which will be addressed at the end of the talk, and we'll try to get to everybody's questions. All right, so this is a book, believe it or not, that I've been working on for a little over 30 years. Actually started when I was a student at Maine Maritime Academy, and was sort of wandering around Castine, and there were all these ruins from the War of 1812, which I thought were terribly interesting, but nobody had a whole lot of information. And from there, I began unpacking Maine's War of 1812, and it grew from something about Castine to really the entire state, all the way from Holton down to Kittery and Elliott, or from Eastport all the way over to Freiburg on the New Hampshire border. And it's been a really, amazing journey. And I'm hoping people will enjoy my take on Maine. So let me share with you something you may have read, which is a chunk of the preface that sort of brings to the present, why do we care about Maine and the War of 1812? So here's what I wrote. Today, Americans obsess about disorder in the nation. Politics have become bitterly partisan. The news media blatantly take sides, and urban elites and their rural counterparts vie for moral ascendency. There are widespread concerns about riots, coups, and what role the states and federal government have in maintaining order or quelling dissent. Some alarmists even predict the end of American democracy. My message to the reader is, fear not. The Republic has witnessed all these travails before and has not only survived, but generally thrived. And in fact, there's another historian, Heather Cox Richardson, down in Boston, who's an old friend of mine, who has sort of recently said the same thing. Hey, folks, you may think it's bad, but actually things are pretty good. And these things happen. Let's not panic. So my evidence lies in a detailed analysis of Maine's search for a new identity separate from Massachusetts from a period of roughly 1805 to 1820. And the choice of Maine may surprise many who know it as the land of quaint villages, moxie, lobster rolls, and LL Bean, a political and economic backwater tucked in an obscure corner of the nation. And I'm not trying to be cruel there, but trying to call it like I see it. But Maine in the early 1800s was a dynamic place, well placed for international trade with the British Empire, with a rapidly growing population. But increasingly, its citizens will seek separation from Massachusetts. There will be several abortive efforts to get statehood, but ultimately its citizens, really because of the very unhappy experience of the War of 1812, which includes espionage, starvation, riots, enemy occupation, huge taxes, disease, a really awful experience in which Massachusetts refuses to assist, and the federal government can't assist. And some people in Maine take control and decide it is the time for statehood for Maine. Okay, so how do we make this important? I don't think the story of Maine in the War of 1812 by itself really merits a book. So in the academic tradition, we want to create a problem, or better yet, what academics call the dialectic. Ooh, scary word, right? Dialectic. Some people might even say it sounds Marxist or something. It's not really. It's an ancient form of sort of debate that goes back to Socrates, and it involves a thesis, which is one position, which is opposed, which is called an antithesis or antithesis, and out of this tension comes a third thing, which is called synthesis. So in my mind, what we have here is a thesis that we have a new nation called the United States under the Constitution, and that this is, as they say, you might have heard this phrase before, one nation, indivisible, right? That you cannot divide it or break away from. The antithesis to it, which is pushed by people in Massachusetts after 1805, is that no, that the United States is a compact of states who willingly came together, and that individual states can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, or in extremis could even secede from the nation, that this is their right. And this argument went on for quite a while in the 19th century. And of course, it sort of gets resolved at bayonet point in the American Civil War. And we know how that goes. One nation, indivisible. If you try to leave, we're going to drag you back, whether you like it or not. What's interesting to me is that we've got the struggle between the federal government and Massachusetts, and that this battle plays out not in Boston so much, not in Washington so much. It plays out in this area then called the District of Maine, and that is this unlooked for outcome of the struggle between the federal government and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is statehood for the eastern counties of Massachusetts, which becomes the state of Maine in 1820. So my methodology in pursuing this is less to study, sort of political texts and look at, the speeches of presidents and other important people. I've always, as a historian, been much more interested in the actions of ordinary folks. So a lot of my sources come from court records. And I think what people will find surprising about this book is that Maine is a very violent place with a lot of riots. There are spies lurking around. There are these smugglers, and all sorts of crazy things going on. But riots in the streets and about these tensions between the federal government and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So in some ways, Massachusetts is the problem. And Massachusetts is a very important state. John Adams, one of the founders, right, is and the second president of the United States, is sort of vainglorious about Massachusetts as sort of the perfect government. And he can say that because he wrote the Massachusetts state constitution in 1780. So he's sort of boasting about his abilities, but he thinks the town meeting is the perfect form of government, that the Massachusetts approach to religion, and there is state-supported religion in Massachusetts, which is a little odd. We'll talk about that a little bit. And that it's militia, all represent the very best things in the world. And John Adams will tell anybody who's willing to listen to this. He tells it to King George III, he tells it to the French, he tells it to Virginians who are dubious. And in fact, there is this argument that Massachusetts is this very provincial kind of community based on Boston, which thinks very highly of itself. And John Adams is great grandson, I think, is a writer named Henry Adams. And he says, Boston in this period actually is not very American. They're not thinking about the rest of the country. They're sort of obsessed about themselves. Boston doesn't call itself the hub yet, as in the hub of the universe, but they think very highly of themselves, and they're deeply prejudiced against the rest of the country. And Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian and the third president of the United States, says something interesting to a guy named Henry Dearborn, who was a congressman from Maine and the longest serving Secretary of War we ever had. He said, and Jefferson writes that Massachusetts really would be great if it didn't think itself the whole, right? So Massachusetts really is not able to relate to the rest of the country very well. And it actually operates on what I call the Massachusetts ideal, which is based on the Constitution of 1780 and these ideas by John Adams that, that Massachusetts sought a stable society that is hierarchical, right? That you listen to your elders, that you voted the way your superiors would like you to vote, that you exercise what's called deference. So there were the great and the good in Boston, and the rest of the Commonwealth was supposed to listen to them. And the goal is stability and religious conformity. Massachusetts wants everybody to be a Congregationalist, and state taxes actually support the Congregational Church, which means if you're a Baptist, say in Machias, and you want to set up a Baptist church, you're free to do so, and you can petition the legislature to create a Baptist church, but they might say no. And in fact, that happens, which means the Baptists in Machias have to continue to pay taxes to support the congregational minister, and they have to scrape up funds to support their Baptist minister at the same time. So religion is woven deep into the politics of Massachusetts and therefore of Maine. So Massachusetts can be quite provincial, as I said before, to the point where some of the great and the good, as they call themselves in Boston, frequently, on more than one occasion, play with this idea that Massachusetts should secede from the nation and leave. And it's a very awkward situation, which gets very tense because the biggest push for this will actually be during the War of 1812, when the easternmost counties in Massachusetts, which are Hancock and Washington counties in Maine, are under enemy occupation. So this is kind of crazy stuff. And I want to point out again that Maine is quite a disorderly place in this period. And we're talking 1805 to 1820, given to what they called back then tumults. A tumult basically is a riot. You could use the word interchangeably, and there are quite a few of these. And many of these are political. And the political scenario is you have a party called Federalists, who worship sort of George Washington. John Adams is a Federalist. They believe in order. They believe in kind of big business. And especially in Massachusetts, they believe in this hierarchical society. Opposing them are Jeffersonians, who believe much more, or so they say, in the common man, at least the white common man, and are much more egalitarian. And the problem is that old Massachusetts is very Federalist, and the District of Maine is becoming very Jeffersonian. And this is going to create a problem. And I'll give you an example. In North Yarmouth, just outside of Portland, down Casco Bay way, after Jefferson gets elected, after he gets reelected, I guess, in North Yarmouth, a crowd of Federalists in the night attack a sloop that belongs to the local postmaster, who is a Jeffersonian, and they sort of mangled this boat, the sloop, while it's dockside, and they paint on it in big letters, Black Sal and Jefferson. And this, of course, is Black Sal is Sally Hemings, who is the mistress of Thomas Jefferson on his plantation, one of his slaves. I guess we're supposed to say one of the enslaved these days. You know, and there's other ugly incidents that are much more violent than that, and editors who get thrown, newspapers who get thrown into prisons for defaming the character of people, and it's entirely much worse than it is now. We'll put it that way. Even worse than 2020. It's really very ugly. And one of the issues that really bothers people is this issue of religion. So let me read just a little bit, because I don't want to read text too much. But I want to read a little bit about religion, which slides into this idea of it's a pretty violent place too. So Mainers who did not adhere to Massachusetts religious orthodoxy faced insults, discrimination, and occasional violence. George Thatcher derided evangelical meetings as bedlam, and Bowdoin College's president sneered that Methodist circuit riders were, and I quote, illiterate vagabonds. John Neal of Portland recounted that other boys mocked and beat him on account of his Quaker clothing. When a Methodist attempted to preach at Castine's meeting house, a crowd armed with clubs gathered outside and drummed on tin pots to drown out his sermon. The preacher beat a hasty retreat out of town, lest the mob tar and feather him. And this is just a preacher, right? The Massachusetts ideal, however, reserved its most vehement reactions for Roman Catholics. The number of Catholics in the district was tiny, perhaps 2,500 compared to the 250,000 Yankees who were white Protestants in 1810. But Maine, I think this is an amazing fact, Maine had 3 out of the 4 Roman Catholic churches in all of New England. Kind of amazing. Advocating for Catholic rights, the Irish immigrant merchants James Kavanagh and Matthew Cottrell, along with priest Francis Matignon and John Chevres, filed to reclaim taxes that were supporting Newcastle's congregational minister. Newcastle is where the state's oldest Roman Catholic church is. The Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled against them, finding that only Protestant dissenters could claim a ministerial tax share. The judge opined that, and this is really horrific, papists, and that's an insult, to be called a papist as a Catholic is an insult. Papists are only tolerated, and as long as their ministers behave well, we shall not disturb them, but let them expect no more than that. And that's these Massachusetts Congregationalists trying to enforce an orthodoxy. They don't want to hear about Baptists or Free Will Baptists or Methodists, but most especially they don't want to hear about Roman Catholics. In fact, a Roman Catholic priest tries to marry a couple in Wiscasset at one point, and he gets arrested because that is illegal under Massachusetts state law. So other things that are ripping the District of Maine apart include squatters who are resisting Massachusetts state authority. These are land squatters. This is from the book Liberty Men and Great Proprietors by Alan Taylor, right? And we know there's a lot of violence, people even shooting at and on one occasion murdering a surveyor who is working for these people. And that's inland. What Taylor did not cover and had no intention of covering is something that I've been fascinated with for my entire academic life, is that on the coast, simultaneously, there are smugglers who are struggling against federal authorities. And there too, there is exactly one murder. The squatters kill exactly one person, and the smugglers kill exactly one person. The difference is that the squatters are Jeffersonians, and the smugglers are, for the most part, Federalists. So again, you get the struggle against state authority and the struggle against the federal government's authority. And this gets worse during an event after 1807 called Jefferson's Embargo, where no ships are allowed to leave American ports, including Maine ports. This is a big deal at Eastport, I've written a lot about. And this is interesting to this day because the embargo is the first time some legislation is put into use. It's a law usually referred to as the Insurrection Act of 1807. It's an interesting law because it is personally written by Thomas Jefferson when he is president. Now, presidents aren't really supposed to write legislation, but he writes it for a congressman who submits it. And it's really about putting down rebellions because Jefferson has sort of a creep for his first vice president. It's a guy named Aaron Burr, who wanted to take Ohio and the interior of the United States and make it a separate country. So we had to have this law so that the government could counteract something like that. But the first time it actually gets used is in New England to enforce this embargo, and basically empowers the president to use the Army and the Navy to enforce laws when local authorities are having problems, or even to put down a rebellion. So in Maine, this means during this embargo, which lasts from the end of 1807 through early 1809, you get U.S. Army soldiers and the Navy chasing these smugglers. Okay, so kind of ugly stuff. And it gets worse after the embargo ends as we get towards the War of 1812. You get these very bitter politics. And I want to let me get back to the Insurrection Act for a second. You might remember in 2020, this law gets talked about a great deal because of all the unrest on the American West Coast in the cities, right? In places like Portland. And the question is would then President Trump use troops to put this down, because he was, well, some people would say he was within his rights to do that, and others, of course, would debate that. The thing that is a problem in Maine and Massachusetts running up to the War of 1812 is something called gerrymandering. And you probably remember this phrase from high school or history class, or even the news, because it's talked about a lot these days too. It's when you create a congressional district in such a way that you know that your people are going to carry that. So it's a very nasty way politicians have of trying to continue their party's power. And it's named after a guy whose name is not Jerry, it's actually pronounced Gary, Elbridge Gerry, who is the governor of Massachusetts. And he this happens not because of him, but during his time as governor of Massachusetts. And it happens in Maine as well, because we are part of Massachusetts. So congratulations, Maine. Gerrymandering is definitely part of your heritage, right from when the phrase is invented. The other thing that happens under Governor Gary is you get Gary is a Jeffersonian, and he will replace a lot of state office holders with people who are loyal to him, especially if they happen to be Federalists. And this happens in the county courts or with county sheriffs. And it makes a lot of people very, very upset. So this is all the background to the War of 1812. And when we get into the war itself, you have the Jeffersonians supporting the war, and they enlist, and you get these crazy things like Maine sends lots and lots of troops to fight in the War of 1812 because Mainers, for the most part, are Jeffersonians. Massachusetts, with its huge population, sends virtually no soldiers to the War of 1812. It sends a lot of sailors, but not soldiers. Maine far outpaces recruitment compared to Massachusetts because the Federalists hate this war. Well, why do they hate this war? Well, because they hate Jefferson and Madison, those guys. So they were never going to support the war anyways. And part of it's religious. The Massachusetts congregational clergy, and there are a lot of congregational clergy in Maine as well, oppose the war from the pulpit, which is awkward. There's a lot of really, really high taxes. Taxation increases by something like 500% during the course of the war. And can you imagine what would happen to your personal finances if your taxes increased by 500%? You probably would be extremely unhappy. And in fact, we do get tax revolts breaking out in Maine. And then there's a war itself. The British out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, blockade the Maine coast. And Maine has a problem. You might have noticed Maine is kind of cold. It isn't really the best farming territory. Maine could not feed itself. Maine always relied very heavily on importing flour from places like Maryland or especially Virginia to feed itself, especially over the course of the winter. But you have British ships intercepting these supplies, and you have Mainers, and this is not a well-known story, you have Mainers starving to death, especially in Hancock County for some reason. And this is recorded by congregational ministers. And of course, it's the poor people who starve to death first. There's a woman and her children who starved to death in Hancock County. I think it's a woman and 3 children. I'm assuming that the husband is probably away fighting the war. But anyways, they don't have an adult male in the house to feed them, and they starve to death. And even a lawyer in Ellsworth, a Dartmouth educated guy, is he's writing letters like, the family's really hungry, and he's a lawyer. He's a rich guy, and he's starving. So famine stalks the land. War is never a happy event. Disease is a problem in towns like Wiscasset, and many people take this as some sort of divine sign that God is unhappy with the United States for going to war with Britain. And they read all sorts of omens. They might see clouds that they see as shaped like coffins. And the Federalists always, are claiming this is a sign. God is unhappy with us. There's enemy occupation, right? At the end of the war, in September of 1814, the British occupy all of Maine east of the Penobscot River. And this is a deeply humiliating experience. In communities like Hamden and Bangor, it's not only humiliating, people are getting imprisoned, people's homes are getting destroyed. maliciously. The British sailors and soldiers will simply destroy all the furniture in a house, slaughter animals indiscriminately, and all with the goal of humiliating American citizens and impressing upon them the idea that you cannot resist us, and if you do, you're going to lose all your property, all your worldly goods. And this is pretty effective in impressing upon Eastern Mainers that they should not try to rebel against British authority. And the book goes into a fair amount of detail of the sort of the psychological elements of being under enemy occupation. And one of the interesting things, it's not unlike France in 1940 when the Germans take over, that law enforcement tends to collaborate. Well, what and I'm talking about the sheriffs and their deputies. Well, why does law enforcement collaborate? Well, just as in France, you know, law enforcement is about maintaining order. It isn't about maintaining liberty. It's about keeping things orderly. And so the sheriff in Machias and the sheriff in Castine will collaborate with the British. And this is going to cause them problems after the war, of course. There are riots in Maine over war-related issues. Sometimes you have state militia in riots against federal troops. No guns. Well, you know, guns are fired, but not many people get shot. A couple people get shot, and you know, jails get stormed by angry mobs so that they can release the inmates in some of these incidents. So by the end of the war, in December of 1814, Maine has a problem. Massachusetts has essentially refused to step up and defend the district. And it's pretty clear that the federal government is unable to because it is broke. Furthermore, Massachusetts is threatening to secede from the nation along with, you know, the rest of New England. And that's going to drag Maine with it. And people start to divide and they start to talk about arming. You know, Republican towns, Jeffersonian towns start saying, those Federalists are traitors. We should start arming ourselves because we are going to be in violent conflict with our Federalist neighbors. And Federalists are doing the same thing as well. And the stress of the War of 1812 promises to break into a civil war in Maine. The happy news is that doesn't happen. Why doesn't that happen? Because peace breaks out on December 24th of 1814 in Ghent in Belgium. A treaty is signed. Congress will approve it, and by February of 1815, everybody knows that the war is over, and everybody's happy. But there are memories of this war, very bitter memories, which are going to be compounded by returning prisoners of war. There were a lot of Mainers in a prison in Halifax, many of whom got transferred to an even grimmer prison in Britain called Dartmoor, and there was something called the Dartmoor Massacre in England, where after the war was over, the prisoners got a little rowdy. The British troops panicked and they fired into these crowds. And there was a disproportionate number of Mainers in that crowd because many of the prisoners there were sailors, and you know, Maine and sailors, right? So these guys come back scarred badly. And very bitter about Federalists who oppose the war. There are people who are scarred by this British occupation. There are people castigating the state of Massachusetts for its really pretty treasonable actions during the war. And when I say treason, I'm talking about the real deal. The governor of Massachusetts sends a representative from Maine, almost certainly our friend, the attorney from Ellsworth, who was starving, sends him to Halifax to actually negotiate support from the British should Massachusetts secede from the United States. And the British are quite glad to listen to this. Okay, so Massachusetts at the end of the War of 1812 is sort of a pariah state. Everybody looks with disgust at Massachusetts, and Massachusetts doesn't really mend until the 1820s and become accepted again as sort of, okay, oh, you're okay, Massachusetts. We don't hate you so much anymore. Although I would point, a lot of people don't like Massachusetts in this country. If you've watched any Westerns at all, it's always the dude from Boston who gets out of the stagecoach that everybody hates, right? We can discuss that in the conversations later on. But ultimately, after the War of 1812, the federal government is able to repair its reputation in Maine and sort of woo the people of Maine in various ways, whereas Massachusetts, not so much, and there's all this lingering resentment, and Maine tries to vote for independence a couple of times. Massachusetts doesn't obstruct, but they don't help either, but eventually it does happen, and Maine becomes a state in 1820. And you would think, having separated from Massachusetts and being so disgusted by the conduct of Massachusetts during the war, and disgusted by how Massachusetts ruled Maine as a sort of colony, and discriminated against people from Maine who they thought were all rustic boobs, that Maine would have rejected all things Massachusetts. Now, here's the irony. Maine does no such thing. Maine crafts a new state constitution for itself, and what does it do? It cribs the thing almost verbatim from the Massachusetts state constitution. When it comes time for Maine to build a state house in Augusta, what does it do? It copies the Massachusetts state house in Boston. So while the statehood people were saying Massachusetts is horrible and we really need to get away from them, after Maine does indeed become a state, Maine, in fact, sort of apes Massachusetts and imitates it in many ways, which is really one of those quirks of human nature that you just got to kind of shake your head and wonder, why did they do things that way? So I haven't talked about military operations very much. I'm quite glad to answer questions about that. They're a little convoluted. And my big conclusion is, hey, read the book. You don't have to buy the book, but pester your local librarian to get the book. But you're going to see a lot of stuff about privateers, about the US Navy fighting the Royal Navy, like with the Enterprise Boxer duel off Monhegan in 1813. A lot of stuff about troops being used to chase smugglers. So for those of you who are military or maritime historians, plenty of stuff for you here. And again, if you're from Perry or Eastport, you're going to find stuff here you like, but so will people from Gouldsboro or Kittery or Elliott or Augusta or Waterville. It's really, or Holton for that matter. So it really is about the whole state, and it's about ordinary people and their actions. And I think it's a very different twist. I think before this book came out, I think you could perceive Maine history, with the exception of, maybe guys like Alan Taylor writing about squatters. Oh, it's a prosaic place, and nothing goes on there. Far from it. The tensions are really ugly, and in my mind, kind of reflect some of the things going on today. So that's my presentation, and I'm hoping to get a lot of really good questions. So let's take a look at some of those. Okay, Holly was kind enough to put in the chat section to share with us the link for University of Massachusetts Press, where you can get that 40% discount. It's about a $35 book, about $20 with the discount. Thank you, Holly. That's very, very generous of you. And Mike Gleason says, Boston thinks very highly of itself. Some things never change. And I agree. And I look forward. Next month I give a presentation to the Maine Historical Society, and that'll be pretty easy. But I think at some point this winter I'm going to give a presentation to the Massachusetts Historical Society, who has all these paintings hanging up in its headquarters of all these people who are these pretty horrible Federalists, and I'm sorry to take sides there, who really thought they were going to make a lot of money off those squatters up in Maine, and thought very little of the people in Maine. If anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to unmute and hey, let's talk.
Joshua, this is Stephen.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, it's good. It's so good to see so many people I know, especially Dick Swain. I haven't seen Dick since pre-COVID days. I'm in Pembroke. Now, I hope you'll eventually do a program for the Pembroke Historical Society, and you really should do one for the New York Historical Society. They might get a kick out of it. So I'm going to muddy the waters here a little bit, because you did bring up religion, and I think religion overlaps into race and ethnicity. So I'm going to throw this out. You did mention the Irish once with regard to Roman Catholicism, and being a person who is not Anglo and not a Protestant, I want to just ask, is what we're looking at an Anglo Civil War between Anglo-Saxon Protestants, principally Congregationalists, versus English Anglicans? And where do Irish immigrants, who are principally Roman Catholic, and certainly a large number of them in Pembroke by this time, who are going to be, I believe, anti-British by inclination, French Canadians, who always seem to vanish out of the history of Maine, and again would be primarily Roman Catholic, and also Native American communities, and certainly in the area of Eastport, Perry, Scipio, you have early Roman Catholic missionary work, and many of the Native Americans of the Passamaquoddy remain to this day to be Roman Catholic. And are they just backing away from this because whatever the outcome is, they realize that they're still going to be near the bottom of this hierarchy, or are they?
So the Irish don't like to admit it, but there are plenty of Protestant Irish.
Yes, there are,
including among the immigrants. And the other thing is about the Catholics, that for the white Catholics, what I should say, or Anglo Catholics, 2,500 of them compared to 250,000 white Protestant Yankees. That ain't a civil war. That would be a massacre, and it ain't going the Catholics' way with only 2,500. So no, they're they are an oppressed, very small minority. The division is much more between the standing order, which is the Congregational Church, which is officially supported by the state of Massachusetts. Here's an odd fact most Americans are not aware of, that the Constitution mentions separation of church and state. That really only exists at the federal level. That there were several states that supported Protestant churches with taxpayer money. Now, and the problem with that is that religion becomes political then if you're paying taxes for it. So the issue is more between Congregationalists, and their big competitors in Maine are Baptists, who reject the idea of Harvard-educated clergy and a lot of their dogma, and especially their education at Harvard College, and often very influenced by Nova Scotia and New Brunswick evangelicals, which makes it a very interesting cross-border story. So the tension is really sort of Congregationalists versus all other Protestants more. And what's surprising about the anti-Catholic prejudice is that it's carried out by the highest courts, and the most famous and influential judges in all of Massachusetts are really such blind bigots. It's really, you know, sort of cringeworthy. It's really awful. As for the French Canadians, or you know, the population up in northern Aroostook County are around. The war doesn't impact them much. My take is basically is that their big event in 1812 is that a bishop visits them from Quebec, and that's their big event in 1812. The war doesn't impact them very
Josh,
much.
I hate to interrupt you, but Liam has a question in the chat and he'll have to leave
He
shortly.
does. So now that I've answered Stephen's question, let's go to Liam's question. Professor Reardon writes, I'm curious about how you assess the severity of the British as occupiers. Is some of this based on post-war accounts that might have wanted to downplay accommodation while occupied? No, not so much. I have been able to find diaries and letters and court cases and appeals to Congress or other people for assistance that mention very specific incidents. For instance, there's one guy who's sort of plucked off the streets of Castine, a civilian, and he doesn't give the right answer that the British soldiers want to hear, and they send him to prison in Halifax, I think for sass talking the officer, essentially. And the accounts of Bangor, where you are right now, and Hampden are firsthand accounts by the Williamson family, who become some of the first historians of the state of Maine, and they're very detailed. In fact, Williamson has British officers quartered in his home, and he has this very awkward dinner with them and this very awkward conversation where they're talking about the war, and everybody's very forthright. And the British have this funny thing where they actually respect you if you're a Jeffersonian and are a patriot to America. They actually respect that. They go out of their way to humiliate the Federalists, who they regard as traitors and not respectable in any way. Some really interesting stories in the book about this stuff. And the thing that confuses people after the war, people will travel to Castine, and where the people will just sort of gush about how nice the British were and how they paid in silver coins for everything. And you know, the observers are like, well, maybe that's not what you want to be saying, right? So kind of interesting. So the accommodation thing, you know, many people leave the occupied area. Some will actually show a lot of bravado. Most sort of slink away, and a lot of people just stay tight and they'll take the oath or whatever. The weird thing about the occupation is that the British want to confiscate everybody's guns, which is entirely reasonable on their part, right? And it's the Federalists who scream about this. And the British didn't know it, but when they invaded Castine, they landed in this intensely Federalist area of Maine. Castine, Bucksport, Blue Hill, and Ellsworth, intensely Federalist. The pushback by the Americans against the British seizing their weapons is actually by the rich Federalists who said, you can't take our guns. The poor Jeffersonians are going to slaughter us in our beds if you take our guns. So the British actually relent. They say, well, okay, if you sign this oath, you can keep your gun. The British, after, you know, the battles over at Hampden and whatnot, and after they sacked Bangor, fairly reasonable on the whole. But there is this almost civil war aspect to this between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists that I find fascinating, especially when you get into the gun thing. Is really interesting, and I think I think that chapter that deals with British occupation, or the chapters that deal with British occupation, is probably what a lot of people will find the most surprising and the most valuable about this book.
We have another question from Jonathan Ring.
Okay, during the blockade, could the Mainers fish to feed their families? You said they could not receive wheat from Virginia, flour from Virginia, so Virginia superfine flour. At your peril, you could fish. And let me suggest that you don't want to eat cod 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. And that's going to cause its own dietary issues. So yes, there was some fishing, but there's a war on, and maybe that British warship comes alongside your fishing boat, and some days they want to buy your fish, and other days they're going to say, you're our prisoners, and they burn your fishing boat. And you just don't know what mood the British are in from day to day. So it's very unpredictable. And as the war progresses, the British get much more aggressive about burning coastal shipping. So there's a family, farmers from Waldoboro, they're German speakers from Waldoboro, and they're just going to Boston on their little schooner with a bunch of firewood, and the British capture them, they burn their boat, and that family, it's a father and several sons, end up in Dartmoor prison in England for the rest of the war. And all they were doing was moving cordwood, but that's war, right? So good question about the fish. I appreciate that. Liam Lefty says, thanks for a great session. Stephen asks another question about guns. So Josh's gun statement raises the question of the right to bear arms being connected to control of underlings, squatters, and slave persons, the urban underclass. So yeah, there is a connection, and that is the idea of a militia. A militia is not strictly a military body designed to defend against foreign invasion. Militiamen are much more likely to be used to maintain order and suppress a riot. And some militia units are very fancy. They have elaborate uniforms, and they're sort of clubs for the sons of rich men. And those units are definitely engaged in a sort of class warfare. That's probably the stuff you're looking for, Steve, right? Class warfare against squatters or poor people or just Jeffersonians in general. And they do get called out to do that. And some of these fancy units that are Federalists, the one in Ellsworth is the one that cracks me up. For starters, its commander is an Englishman who had only recently been naturalized and sort of has to apologize to his troops. And the other thing is that, and this is really awkward, the uniforms, they get to pick uniforms for themselves. Their uniforms are red. Oh, that's, Americans aren't supposed to do that. So again, it gets awkward, and it speaks to some of these complex loyalties going on. So the lawyer's name was not Wiswell Hawley. It was, oh boy, I can't remember because there are an awful lot of names. But Hawley, if you email me, I'll send you his name. He was a classmate of Webster. And he was a deep Federalist, and he was also almost certainly the guy who got sent to Halifax. That was all done very secretly, so his name was never mentioned, but it really looks that way. So an interesting character, and Ellsworth, a very interesting community because it did have so many Federalists, including the sheriff, who's a guy named Moses Adams. Moses Adams is a Federalist. He's an arch Federalist. He's the nastiest kind of Federalist there is. And he collaborates with the British. And just a few weeks after the end of the war, his wife is found murdered in their home in a really savage fashion. Moses Adams goes to jail, his own jail that he'd just been presiding over as sheriff. and he gets tried in the meeting house in Castine, and the court, the jury finds him innocent. They cannot prove it, but the court of public opinion has a different idea. Apparently, one of the accusations is that Moses Adams had a mistress somewhere around, as well as this wife. And as he left the house, a free man, but no longer sheriff, of course, the crowd hisses him. They clearly felt he was guilty. And a really savage event. And he does live out his days in Maine, but he actually retires to inland Maine and marries a girl who's like 17 or something like that, which is also pretty creepy. So not a nice man. But there was another Hancock County sheriff who was even worse, who had been a Federalist before the war and got removed for political reasons. He continued to live in Castine till 1820, but after statehood, he moved to Belchertown, Massachusetts. And this guy was almost as bad. This guy in Belchertown, Massachusetts, kidnaps a free Black woman and is going to transport her down south to sell her into slavery for $600. Luckily, a crowd rescues her. But what a creep. His name was Mason Shaw. Okay, Mike Gleason says, did I say Dearborn? Yeah, as in the guy, Dearborn, Michigan is named after. Henry Dearborn was a veteran of the American Revolution who had fought under Benedict Arnold in Quebec, gone up the Kennebec River and all that. Was a congressman after the war, a militia officer. He was the U.S. Marshal for the District of Maine, who hanged the first person ever executed by under the authority of the U.S. Constitution in Portland, was a congressman, and then became Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of War. You can read that as Secretary of Defense for both Jefferson administrations. So Dearborn is a really big deal, and he hung his hat in Gardner on the Kennebec River. And later he's going to drift down to Massachusetts and live in Boston. He does what he does. He's a very lucky guy. He marries a fantastically wealthy widow, and, so he does all right for himself. Yeah. So Holly writes, yes, Moses Adams murdered his wife and got away with it. That's the general consensus these days, and relocated to Dedham. Out in the woods. And my understanding is he was a pretty shattered guy after that experience, and a little unbalanced even maybe. So many interesting stories. This is what I love about Maine history, is that there are all these stories. Are there any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Hi, this is Fran. Thank you. Fascinating. I didn't know much of any of this, and I like to think I'm somewhat, much of a reader and have some background. You started your conversation by saying your presentation by pointing out that you take some comfort with some friends of yours who were saying now that life is our history has always been chaotic and somewhat ugly, and we're certainly at that place now. And you use the word complex loyalties, and we certainly know that in the Revolution, there were complex loyalties, and in the Civil War, and so I think we find ourselves now. Not to get political, I just want to know: is there some comfort? I know we might want to take some comfort from that notion that we've had a history that has been turbulent. But is it possible that in certain times in our history and now that there are times when we come to that, there might not be able to turn back very easily when the population becomes so uninformed and so divided, and so with so much misinformation, and social media is a whole new, so we have new factors now. So is it just the same? Can we sit back and can we sit back and say that, okay, you know, we've been down this road before, and hang tight, it'll, you know, it'll swing back? Or
I suspect it will. And what's really interesting about this period is Canada's had the same issue, and there's some hearings going on up in Ottawa right now. They're very interesting. Americans much more readily accept that there can be disorder and violence in public discourse than Canadians, who for a long time tried to think, oh, we're the peaceable nation. Well, humans, just like anybody else. So my take is, without getting political, because I think these past events, there's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's sort of a funhouse mirror reflection of current society in a way, is that American society has had these issues repeatedly. With in the 1830s with the nullification crisis, with South Carolina threatening to secede, with the actual American Civil War, with the civil rights issues in the 50s and 60s. I think the unusual thing is that World War II did a pretty good job in suppressing these regional identities and loyalties and these other problems, and the Cold War did a pretty good job at unifying us, with you know, with the exception of the civil rights things.
yeah,
and I don't think it's a coincidence that the resurgence of all this noise and anger and misinformation and stuff is occurring just as the World War II generation is dying off.
oh, that's an excellent point. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
That's my take. That actually maybe the ugly discourse might be the norm, and that we didn't know how good we had it.
Yeah, I've often thought of that, but thank you. Because I won't say anything more after this. I just do think that we study history for a reason, and it's impossible not to layer it on our current, you know, any thinking person would layer it on the contemporary issues of any year that we're living in. I would hope that's half the those reasons we study, rather than it's just interesting. But yeah, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and Fran, I think there are some similarities. You know, there's difference between urban elites and rural folks is one of the things going on. So I think there, again, it's not one for one, but hopefully you'll read the book, take it out from the library or whatever,
Absolutely.
and go, well, that's something to think about, and even the religious thing and all that. So
oh, I will definitely get it. Thank you very, very much. Fascinating. I didn't know much of any of that, so thank you.
You're entirely welcome. And I think you know, it's been a real voyage for me to, you know, parsing this stuff, because I think local historians, frankly, not keen to emphasize the disorder in their societies, right? This stuff gets buried in court records and obscure corners of the newspapers, which are a lot like media today, are very, you know, out there, left or right.
Yeah.
And that was true in the newspapers back then too. The best example being a little newspaper called the Gazette of Maine that was published in Buckstown, which is now Bucksport on the Penobscot River, the most radical Federalist newspaper in Maine. And it had this funny history that it was run by sort of a Federalist editor, but he won the lottery and he moved to Boston and bought a newspaper there, and he sold it to his sort of number two guy, editor at the newspaper, who was a really rabid Federalist. And this guy was such a Federalist who seemed to hate the idea of American democracy, that just before the war starts, he emigrates to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he starts one of Nova Scotia's foremost newspapers called the Acadian Recorder. Wow. Crossing the border, like, it's just really pretty amazing. And a lottery story that you almost never hear those, right?
Okay. I have a question about the the disestablishment of the Congregationalists.
Uh-huh.
When Maine became a state, did it adopt the Congregationalist Church as an established church the way it was in Boston?
It does
In
not.
Massachusetts?
That is one of the differences, because most of the pro-statehood people had been Baptists in point of fact. And this was a real sticking point. And this gets covered in pretty good detail in the book. But so that is one of the differences between Maine, is we disestablished the church. The Congregationalists in Massachusetts hang in, I think, till 1832 or something like that. And in fact, the Maine Constitution gives you complete freedom of religion, including for Catholics, including for Hindus, Muslims, and Jews. So they're really kind of ahead of the curve on that. I don't think they ever imagined that there would be Hindus and Jews and Muslims living in Maine, but of course there are now. That's one of the success stories of the Maine Constitution. As Maine goes, so goes the nation. I'm not so sure about that. The old joke usually given on election nights is, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. If only it were so. But anyways. All right.
Josh,
Stephen,
Stephen Sanfilippo had a question in the chat.
about secession.
Yeah, if I could ask, what you're talking about with Maine, there are 4 secession movements going on. There's the United States reaffirming its secession from the British Empire. There's the Hartford Convention, New England, led by Massachusetts, wanting to secede from the United States. There's, at the same time in the West, Aaron Burr, I guess this has already passed, but that secession movement for Kentucky to form some kind of alliance with the Spanish Empire to be, so there's Maine wants to secede from Massachusetts. And I just wonder if you could look in your crystal ball here. There are a lot of secession movements in the United States today. New York City, Long Island from New York State. Parts of California want to secede from other parts of California, and that's a political divide. Yeah. There are a few others. I've even heard that Washington, Hancock, and Aroostook County should secede from the rest of Maine and form a separate state. And people who say this are quite serious about it.
And we're not alone. Alberta wants to secede from Canada.
Yeah.
There you go. You know, I think there's always this sort of loose talk. When I was a kid growing up on Cape Cod and the islands were going to secede from Massachusetts too. And they even had a flag and stuff. So the secession thing is interesting, especially with Aaron Burr, but you got to remember his vice president when he's pulling these hijinks. And if you think our politicians are bad now, let's remember that Vice President Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president of the United States, shoots Alexander Hamilton, the former Secretary of the Treasury, in Weehawken, New Jersey. Okay, we haven't gotten to that level, folks. And let's all knock on wood and hope we don't get back to that. So it is pretty nutty, right? As for secession, you know, the thing I focus on is Maine and yes, there are competing secessions between Maine and Massachusetts and New England seceding from the United States. In my mind, that question of states seceding from the country doesn't really get settled until the Civil War, and it comes through loud and clear: no, you may not secede from the country. So how that's played out ever since has been, yes, states split or threaten to split more often if they're unhappy, you know, and it's a variation of the playground, as are so many things, right? I'm going to take my ball and go home. And of course, you know, the sophisticates in Boston are horrified that, you know, they think Maine doesn't have the talent to rule itself. There aren't enough people. And one of the foremost critics of Maine statehood is actually John Adams, who is quite snotty about it, actually, in his letters to his Harvard classmates. So one of the aspects of John Adams you won't see in that mini series about him, right? He could be quite snide. So yeah, secession. It's always there. And it's never going to go away. You know, very seldom acted on. And to get back to some of the earlier political points, you get these tensions in societies, and it's really sort of a game of chicken, right? We're going to take our ball and go home. We're going to secede. Oh, and you know what happens? You get Quebec. Quebec is never going to become independent. Why should they? Because Ottawa gives them every single friggin' thing they need. And they'd be crazy to leave Canada, right? They've got the system down. So look north for a little inspiration on that one. Quebec has really got it figured out. And I don't think my Canadian friends will disagree with me in that regard. Although they're certainly free to. Okay. Any other questions? That was a great conversation, by the way, and I really hope. I think you're going to be seeing this book around a lot and hearing about it a lot. I think it's going to be in a lot of bookstores because we haven't had a book about why Maine becomes a state since Ron Banks wrote a book called Maine Becomes a State back in 1970. So it's been a half century, and it's time for it to get re-examined. He wrote a very thorough, excellent book, but it's almost without conflict. My difference is that Maine becomes a state because there are people having fist fights in town halls, you know, like the selectmen are duking it out, and people are getting beaten up, and there are riots in the streets. So it's a much more complicated story than I think what Banks had.
Hello, Josh. If I could ask you a question.
Sure, Bob.
It's Bob
Thank you, Canadians.
I'm under the impression that the British occupation troops, particularly in Eastport, had a really easy go of it. They got on fairly well with the local people. They put on plays and played bands and did all that good stuff. Several of the soldiers married local girls. We collected taxes and took it home and founded a university with the money that we borrowed from you guys. But I got the distinct impression that the occupation troops were not hassled, weren't really badly treated by the local, quite congenial. Am I right in that?
I think that's largely true. So after the initial occupation and battle, especially over by Castine, you know, where the troops rough people up to let them know who's in charge, people get it. Oh, okay, you're in charge. And there are some ugly incidents in Eastport too, where people get flogged publicly. And it's usually, why are they flogged publicly? Well, because the locals and the British soldiers got along too well, and the locals were encouraging British soldiers to desert. And so there were some incidents like that. And it's funny, but and I think you've pointed this out in other discussions we've had, that the British officers asked their troops, well, why are you guys deserting? You know, are you being treated poorly? Are the quarters bad? Is the food bad? No. They just saw an opportunity.
Bored.
Yeah,
They were bored.
And you and I have talked about the fellow who goes and marries a Robinston girl who is not a high class woman, I think, and he very quickly finds out maybe he made a bad deal, and he goes crawling back to the British Army, who's glad to accept him back. I've got a very interesting chapter that deals with deserters, especially British deserters, who are of many nations. There is a Belgian guy who founds a a little town next to Ellsworth. He'd been in Napoleon's army, captured. The British offer him a deal. You can get out of this prisoner of war camp if you join the British Army. He does. And then he deserts with another Belgian friend. And they live in Maine for the rest of their lives. And you get actually a lot of British.
What town is that, Josh?
Oh gosh, is it Eastbrook? What's next to?
Oh, there is an Eastbrook.
Is that just north of Ellsworth?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. And I think his name is DeMeyer.
Oh, Holly knew.
His tombstone is very interesting. Way out in Eastbrook, Maine, because it says in big letters, "A soldier of Napoleon."
Wasn't there a difference in how the British treated the locals in Eastport as compared to Castine because they felt Eastport was British from the get-go? It wasn't captured so much as taken back. They thought it was their own property.
I don't think the military officers are that philosophical about it. To them, it's merely a matter of maintaining discipline. And they do end up shooting by firing squad some deserters out of Castine, 2 guys, which is interesting because the local general at Castine executes these guys on his own authority. Now, that isn't supposed to happen in the British Army. Literally, if you want to shoot somebody by firing squad, it's supposed to go to the Prince Regent at the time. But during the war, every year he would send a letter to the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, Sherbrooke, giving him this authority. But it was such a weird situation in Castine that the local general shoots these guys almost immediately in a very bloody execution, and apologizes to Sherbrooke. I kind of had to do it. So I haven't quite figured this out yet. Maybe they deserted with their weapons, which makes it worse. But I've analyzed the statistics for that regiment, and throughout the Napoleonic Wars, very little desertion. Their peak desertion is in Castine. And I think that's because America, right? There are opportunities there. There's a perpetual labor shortage. Mainers love to hire British deserters, especially if they were weavers from Ireland who had skills, and they would lure them away, and that could get you in trouble if the British found out. Now, the American forces in Maine in the winter of 1814, 1815 are going to execute some American deserters down in Portland, and they are actually tied to a post. Not tied to a post. No, actually, I guess they're kneeling on coffins, and they're going to be shot. And they have the local garrison, over 1,000 men there to witness this. But it doesn't happen. In fact, it's all sort of theater. At the last minute, an officer shows up on a horse, and he has a presidential pardon for these guys. And it was, while the prisoners didn't know this, they were never going to be executed. It was local congressman got involved and rescued them, so they weren't executed. And this is a way of showing the wisdom and kindness of President Madison, right? So it is a form of theater. But the deserters interest me a lot. A very interesting group on the whole.
There was also, Josh, discussion between the British and American military to come up with an agreement where they would exchange deserters.
Yes.
And British would give back American deserters, Americans get, and yeah. I don't think it came to much.
Predates the war. And during the war, that doesn't happen. A couple interesting incidents again at the very end of the war. Some British soldiers desert in Machias, which the Americans are just in the process of reoccupying after the war. And there's a guy named Lieutenant Morse, Samuel Adams Morse. He's who was from Machias anyways. Very funny though, Morse must have had a down east accent, because the British soldiers in their deposition refer to him as Lieutenant Moss, M-O-S-S. So I think the way Yankees used to pronounce Morse was Moss. But he actually encourages a sergeant and several privates to desert into the American army. And there's another case towards the end of the war where a guy in Wiscasset writes to President Madison and says, hey, if you want to win the war, let's just pay the British to desert. And, you know, not a bad idea. And in fact, a lot of the British deserters from Castine especially will cross Penobscot Bay and they will enlist in the American army. Well, why do they do that? Well, you get an enlistment bounty, cash on the barrelhead right there. Oh, and you get somebody who's going to feed you and clothe you. And these guys usually go into American units that are guarding the forts in Portland. But, you know, having deserted one military, very often they keep on moving and they will desert the American military as well. So I guess we shouldn't really be surprised by that. And again, this is all covered in the book. There's 30 years of research, so lots of stories here. Other questions or concerns? Because we've been over an hour, folks. Boy,
Right.
Families.
Josh, this has been wonderful. When is your next presentation? You said November.
November 8th, I think, for the Maine Historical Society. So you folks were my guinea pigs. And I thank you for being so patient and listening to me. It's been a whole lot of fun. You know, I can't tell you, 30 years of work. It is such a relief to get this off my desk and out of my life.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you, really.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Mm.
Paula, if you scroll up in the chat, Holly had provided a link and the discount on that book.
Oh, and Holly, who did us another kindness, she sends us a link to the grave in Eastport of that British deserter where it says Soldier of Napoleon. So you can just click on that and you will find that. Really,
Eastbrook.
Brook, I think. Right?
Yeah.
And atop a blueberry barren, she says. So Holly, I thank you for that and all your other support. Oh, I got one last question. I can't read your Darcy Stevens. Hi, Josh. I'm a student of Liam's and also the book review editor of Maine History. I'd like to send you an email to talk about your work and having it reviewed for the journal. Well, of course, I'd be delighted. And my email is really easy, and this is for everybody. It's smithj, really boring name, right? smithj @usmma.edu. Actually, Darcy, I'm going to send that to you in chat so that you can capture that. And done. And if anybody else feels like they have to email me, well, my email is public knowledge anyways. You can look me up online. I hope you all enjoy the book. So spread the word. You know, I want to hear about big sales, which in part are going to benefit the Border Historical Society, which, you know, their support was a big deal of making this happen. So I really appreciate them and Ruth and Pam and everybody else in the Border Historical Society, and Stephen for his support, and Holly for her support, and Liam for, you know, really all really appreciate and really have always enjoyed these conversations with all of you.
I just want to say what a great pleasure it's been for me to know you since 2014, since the 200th anniversary of the capture of Eastport. That's when I met you, and it's been wonderful. But I think probably this is time for us to say goodnight, and we will see you next month, and I'll send out a wrap-up with how you can get the book. So thank you for joining us tonight, everyone.
Good night, all.
Good night.